Marcus Chen stared at the lighthouse through his truck's windshield. Rain drummed against the glass as he sat in the driver's seat, engine off, trying to make sense of what he was looking at. The lighthouse stood on a cliff like a white finger pointing at the dark sky. Lightning flashed, and for a moment the whole structure seemed to glow. He had never met his great-uncle Richard. The family always said the old man was strange, living alone in Maine with no visitors. Now Richard was dead, and somehow Marcus had inherited this place. The lawyer in town had been weird about it too. Keep the light burning, he had said. Never go below. Strange words that made no sense. Marcus grabbed his duffel bag from the passenger seat and stepped into the rain. The wind hit him like a slap, carrying the smell of salt and something else he could not name. His boots crunched on the gravel path leading to the lighthouse door. The sound echoed off the cliff walls below. The key turned easily in the lock. Inside, everything was clean and organized. Too clean for a place where an old man had lived alone for decades. Marcus flipped the light switch and bright LED bulbs lit up the main room. That was strange too. The lighthouse looked old from outside, but the electrical work was modern. He dropped his bag and looked around. The main floor had a kitchen, a sitting area, and stairs leading up to the light room at the top. Another set of stairs went down to what must be the basement. His great-uncle had left notes on the kitchen table. Simple instructions about the lighthouse operations, meal schedules, and maintenance tasks. Marcus climbed the spiral stairs to the top. The light room was impressive. A massive lens system focused a beam that could be seen for miles across the ocean. But this was not like any lighthouse equipment he had seen in the Navy. The metal parts had a strange blue tint, and the electronics hummed with more power than seemed possible. His phone started acting up near the control panel, the screen flickering and showing random numbers. Back downstairs, he heated up a can of soup and tried to relax. The rain had stopped, but the wind still howled around the lighthouse walls. Marcus had come here to get away from people, to find some peace after his last deployment had gone wrong. The nightmares were getting worse, and the doctors said isolation might help. This place was certainly isolated. That night, he lay in the small bedroom on the second floor, listening to the ocean waves crash against the cliff below. Sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the explosion again, heard his teammates screaming. He sat up and checked the time. 2 a.m. Unable to rest, Marcus went downstairs to make coffee. As he passed the basement door, he noticed something odd. The door was made of heavy metal, not wood, like the rest of the house. It had no visible lock, just a smooth surface with strange symbols carved around the frame. The symbols seemed to shift when he looked at them directly, making his eyes water. He touched the door. It was cold, much colder than it should be. The metal felt different too, not quite like steel or aluminum. More like something that had been made in a place with different rules about how metal should behave. Marcus pressed his ear against the door. Silence. Complete silence. Not even the sound of the ocean waves could be heard through the thick metal. He stepped back and studied the door more carefully. No hinges were visible from this side. How did it open? Curiosity got the better of him. Marcus raised his fist and knocked 3 times on the door. The sound was dull and heavy, like knocking on the side of a mountain. He waited, feeling foolish for expecting any response. Then it came. 3 knocks from the other side. Marcus jumped back so fast he nearly fell. His heart pounded as he stared at the door. The knocks had been deep and resonant, nothing like the sound his fist had made. They seemed to come from something much larger than a human hand. He waited, barely breathing. Minutes passed, nothing. Maybe he had imagined it. Maybe the stress and lack of sleep were making him hear things. He had been having problems with his mind since the explosion. The doctors said trauma could cause hallucinations, but the knocks had sounded so real. Marcus went back upstairs and tried to sleep, but every time he started to drift off, he heard those 3 deep knocks echoing in his memory. When morning came, he was exhausted and shaky. He made breakfast and tried to convince himself it had been a dream. He spent the day exploring the lighthouse and the surrounding area. The building sat on a rocky outcrop connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land. No other houses were visible for miles. The nearest town was 20 minutes away by truck. Behind the lighthouse, he found a small shed filled with tools and equipment. Some of it was normal maintenance gear, but other items were strange. Devices with no obvious purpose, made from the same blue-tinted metal as the lighthouse equipment. One looked like a cross between a wrench and a tuning fork. When he picked it up, it hummed softly and made his teeth ache. Inside the shed, Marcus also found his great-uncle's journal. The old man had neat handwriting and had recorded daily observations about weather, ship traffic, and lighthouse operations. But some entries were different. They talked about the watchers and keeping the barrier strong. Richard had written about voices from below and the importance of never letting the light fail. The journal entries became stranger as Marcus read further. His great-uncle had been tracking celestial movements, recording electromagnetic readings, and monitoring something he called the sleeper's vitals. The last entry was dated just 3 days before Richard's death. It said only, "The door grows warm. Something is changing. God help whoever comes after me." That evening, Marcus stood at the basement door again. Part of him wanted to ignore what had happened the night before. Part of him needed to know if it had been real. He raised his hand and knocked once, then twice, then 3 times. The response came immediately. 3 knocks, deep and powerful, seeming to come from far below the basement floor. This time Marcus did not run. He pressed his hand against the cold metal and felt a faint vibration, as if something massive was moving on the other side. Whatever was down there, it was alive, and it knew he was here. Marcus looked up at the lighthouse beam spinning overhead, casting its warning light across the dark ocean. His great-uncle had spent decades keeping that light burning, keeping watch over something that waited in the depths below. Now that responsibility had passed to him. He did not understand what he had inherited, but he was beginning to realize it was much more than just a lighthouse. As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, Marcus could still feel the vibrations through the floor beneath his feet. Something was stirring in the darkness below, something that had been waiting a very long time. The lighthouse beam continued its endless rotation, cutting through the night like a sword, holding back whatever lurked in the shadows beneath the cliff. Marcus woke up every hour that night. Each time he started to fall asleep, he heard the knocking again in his dreams. By morning, his hands were shaking from exhaustion and too much coffee. He needed answers about what was happening in his basement. He drove to the town library, a small building that looked like it had been there since the 1800s. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, seemed excited to have a visitor. She had known his great-uncle Richard and was sad to hear about his death. Marcus asked about the lighthouse history. Mrs. Patterson pulled out thick books and old newspaper clippings. The lighthouse had been built in 1847, but the construction had been strange. The workers had complained about weird materials being delivered at night by ships that flew no flags. Several workers had quit, saying the basement construction was unnatural. One newspaper article from 1848 was especially interesting. A worker named James Murphy had given an interview before leaving town. He claimed they had been building around something that was already there, something old and buried deep in the cliff. The foreman had told the workers to ask no questions and just follow the plans. Mrs. Patterson also showed him a collection of ship logs from the 1800s. Captains had reported strange lights coming from the lighthouse that were different from the normal beacon. Some described blue flashes that made their compasses spin wildly. Others mentioned radio interference decades before radio was invented. Back at the lighthouse, Marcus read through more of his great-uncle's journal. Richard had been researching the same history. He had found references to similar structures around the world. Lighthouses, towers, and monuments built in strategic locations, all containing basements that were never supposed to be opened. The journal mentioned a group called the Watchers. Richard believed they were ancient beings who had come to Earth long ago. They had tried to help humanity prepare for some kind of threat, but people had been afraid and had locked them away instead. The lighthouses were not really for guiding ships. They were prisons. That night, Marcus could not stay away from the basement door. The knocking had become routine now. He would knock 3 times and whatever was below would answer. But tonight he tried something different. He knocked 4 times. The response came back as 4 knocks. Then, after a pause, 5 more knocks. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. It was trying to communicate. He knocked 5 times. The response was 5 knocks, then 6. It was showing him mathematical sequences. Whatever was down there was intelligent. Over the next few days, Marcus developed a simple code system. 1 knock for yes, 2 knocks for no. The responses were immediate and consistent. The thing below was definitely trying to talk to him. Marcus asked questions by knocking them out. Are you alive? 1 knock. Are you human? 2 knocks. Are you dangerous? A long pause, then 2 knocks. He started using his engineering background to create better communication. Morse code was too complex, but he developed a number system based on long and short knocks. The entity below learned it quickly, faster than any human could have. Through this system, Marcus learned basic facts. The being called itself something that translated roughly to chronicler. It had been trapped for more than 100 years. It was not from Earth, and it was very, very old. The chronicler began sharing more complex information. It knocked out star charts showing Marcus the positions of constellations from different perspectives. It described planets and solar systems that human astronomers had not yet discovered. The knowledge was vast and precise. Marcus started having strange dreams. He saw images of great ships traveling between stars, carrying beings of light and crystal. He saw worlds with impossible colors and cities that floated in clouds of gas. The chronicler was sharing its memories with him somehow. In one dream, Marcus saw Earth as it had been thousands of years ago. The chronicler's people had come here as refugees, running from something terrible that devoured entire civilizations. They had tried to warn primitive humans about the coming threat, but humans had been too afraid to listen. The lighthouse was not just a prison, it was also a monitoring station. The chronicler had been watching the skies, looking for signs that the enemy was approaching. The strange equipment in the lighthouse was scanning space for energy signatures that would warn of the approaching danger, but the equipment was failing. Without maintenance from someone who understood the technology, the warning system would go dark. Earth would be blind when the enemy finally arrived. Marcus learned that his great-uncle had figured out some of this truth. Richard had been trying to repair the alien technology, but he was working alone and had limited understanding of how it functioned. The stress of keeping the secret and trying to save the world had killed him. Now that responsibility had fallen to Marcus. The chronicler was willing to teach him, but only if he agreed to help. The choice was simple but terrifying. He could leave the chronicler locked up and live a normal life, knowing that humanity might be destroyed by an enemy they never saw coming. Or he could trust an alien being and risk everything to give Earth a fighting chance. The dreams became more vivid. Marcus saw the enemy that was coming. They were called the Devourers, and they were unlike anything in human nightmares. They were part machine, part living tissue, and part something else entirely. They consumed entire worlds, leaving nothing but empty space where planets had once existed. The Devourers moved slowly through the galaxy, taking centuries to travel between star systems. But they were methodical and relentless. They had destroyed the chronicler's homeworld and countless others. They were heading toward Earth's sector of space, and nothing could stop them, unless humanity fought back. The chronicler explained that most species were peaceful when the Devourers arrived. They tried to negotiate or hide or run away. All of them failed. But humans were different. Humans were violent and stubborn and refused to accept defeat. These traits that made humans dangerous to each other might be exactly what was needed to fight an impossible enemy. Marcus spent days thinking about what the chronicler had told him. He walked the cliffs around the lighthouse, watching the ocean and trying to decide what to do. The weight of the choice was crushing. How could one person decide the fate of the entire human race? But as he thought about it, Marcus realized he had already decided. Every night when he went to the basement door, he was choosing to keep talking to the chronicler. Every day when he maintained the lighthouse equipment, he was choosing to keep the warning system operational. He had been a soldier. His job had been to protect people, even when it meant risking his own life. This was the same choice on a bigger scale. Protect humanity by freeing a dangerous alien, or let humanity face annihilation while remaining safely ignorant. On the 7th night after first hearing the knocks, Marcus went to the basement with tools from the shed. The chronicler had been teaching him about the door mechanism through their knocking communications. It was not really a lock. It was a frequency generator that kept something else out. As Marcus began working on the door controls, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He was about to change everything, not just for himself, but for every person on Earth. The lighthouse beam continued its rotation overhead, casting light into the darkness. Soon that light would reveal things that had been hidden for far too long. Marcus worked on the door for 3 days. The mechanism was unlike anything he had seen in his engineering training. The controls required precise electromagnetic frequencies, and the wrong combination could trigger defensive systems that might kill him instantly. The chronicler guided him through each step using their knocking code. The process was exhausting. Marcus had to maintain exact frequency patterns while adjusting crystalline components that hurt to touch with bare hands. His fingertips were burned and bleeding by the second day, but he kept working. The chronicler was patient, correcting his mistakes and encouraging him to continue. On the third night, something clicked. The strange symbols around the doorframe began to glow with soft blue light. Marcus stepped back as the heavy metal door made a deep humming sound and slowly swung open. The basement was not what he had expected. Instead of a dark dungeon, he found himself looking into a chamber carved from living rock that stretched far deeper than should have been possible. Crystalline formations covered the walls, pulsing with gentle light that made the entire space feel alive. At the center of the chamber, floating a few feet above the floor, was the chronicler. Marcus had expected something horrible, but the being before him was beautiful in an alien way. It looked like a sculpture made of living crystal and light, roughly humanoid but taller and more graceful than any person. Its surface shifted between transparent and opaque, revealing complex patterns of energy flowing through its form. The chronicler did not speak with words. Instead, images and thoughts flowed directly into Marcus's mind. The communication was overwhelming at first, like trying to drink from a fire hose, but gradually, Marcus learned to process the information. The first thing the chronicler shared was gratitude. It had been alone for over a century, cut off from its people and unable to fulfill its mission. Marcus had given it hope again. Then came the full truth about why the chronicler was here. The images in Marcus's mind showed him the galaxy as the chronicler saw it. Thousands of civilizations had once thrived among the stars, but they were being systematically destroyed by the Devourers. The enemy was not a single species, but a collective intelligence that consumed entire worlds to fuel its expansion. The Devourers had been spreading across the galaxy for millions of years. They moved slowly but inevitably, leaving nothing but empty space behind them. The chronicler's people had been advanced and peaceful, confident in their technology and wisdom. They had lasted longer than most, but in the end they too had fallen. A few survivors had escaped to warn other worlds. The chronicler had been sent to Earth because long-range scans showed that humans had potential. Most species were too peaceful or too civilized to fight the Devourers effectively. But humans were different. Humans were violent, adaptable, and absolutely refused to give up even when facing impossible odds. The problem was timing. The chronicler had arrived on Earth thousands of years before humans developed space travel or advanced technology. It had tried to help early human civilizations prepare, but people had been too frightened to accept help from something so alien. Instead, they had built prisons to contain the chroniclers and their technology. Marcus saw images of similar sites around the world. Ancient structures that humans thought were temples or monuments were actually containment facilities. The beings inside had been trying to help humanity prepare for what was coming. But fear and misunderstanding had turned helpers into prisoners. Most of the other chroniclers had died over the centuries, their energy slowly fading in isolation. This one had survived by going into a hibernation state, maintaining just enough consciousness to operate the monitoring equipment and wait for someone who might understand. The chronicler showed Marcus what the monitoring systems had detected. The Devourers were approaching Earth's sector of the galaxy. They moved in a vast swarm, consuming everything in their path. Based on their current speed and trajectory, they would reach Earth in approximately 50 years. 50 years to prepare for a war against enemies that had destroyed civilizations, far more advanced than humanity. The chronicler explained that most species tried to fight the Devourers using conventional military tactics. They built big ships and powerful weapons and tried to destroy the enemy through superior firepower. It never worked. The Devourers absorbed and adapted to whatever was used against them. Traditional warfare only made them stronger, but humans might succeed where others had failed because humans did not fight like other species. Humans were unpredictable, stubborn, and willing to try dangerous solutions that more civilized races would never consider. Humans turned their own destructive tendencies into weapons. The chronicler had studied human history through intercepted radio and television signals. It had watched humans fight 2 world wars, develop nuclear weapons, and threaten to destroy their own planet rather than surrender to enemies. This willingness to embrace mutually assured destruction was exactly the kind of thinking needed to fight the Devourers. Marcus felt his mind reeling as he processed this information. The chronicler was asking him to help prepare humanity for a war against cosmic monsters, using human aggression and recklessness as the primary weapons. It sounded insane, but somehow it also made sense. The chronicler offered to share technology that could give humanity a fighting chance. Not weapons exactly, but tools that could be adapted into weapons by creative minds. Energy manipulation systems, space-time distortion fields, and quantum communication networks. The key was to use these technologies in ways the chronicler's peaceful people had never imagined, but accepting this help came with risks. Using the alien technology might alert the Devourers to Earth's location sooner than expected. It might also change humanity in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. There was no guarantee that humans would remain human after integrating alien science into their civilization. Marcus thought about his military experience. He had seen what humans could do when their backs were against the wall. Sometimes they surprised everyone, including themselves, with their ability to adapt and overcome. Sometimes they destroyed themselves in the process. The chronicler also shared a warning. Even with alien technology and human determination, victory was not certain. The Devourers had consumed civilizations that were far more advanced than current human society. Success would require not just better weapons, but a complete transformation of how humans thought about war, survival, and their place in the universe. The choice was still Marcus's to make. The chronicler could not force him to help. It could return to hibernation and wait for someone else to find it, though that might take decades or centuries. By then, it might be too late to prepare adequate defenses. Marcus looked around the crystalline chamber, feeling the weight of impossible responsibility. He was one man who had come to a lighthouse to escape his problems. Now he was being asked to help save the entire human race from extinction. But as he stood there, Marcus remembered something his drill sergeant had told him years ago. When faced with an impossible situation, you had 2 choices. You could give up and die, or you could try something crazy and maybe live. Humans almost always chose the crazy option. That stubbornness, that refusal to accept defeat, was apparently what made humans special in a galaxy full of peaceful species. Maybe it was time to find out if that reputation was deserved. Marcus looked at the chronicler and nodded. He could not speak the alien language, but his meaning was clear. He was ready to help, regardless of the consequences. The chronicler's crystal form pulsed brighter, and Marcus felt a wave of relief and gratitude flow through his mind. For the first time in over a century, the ancient being had an ally in its mission to save 2 species from extinction. Above them, the lighthouse beam continued its rotation, no longer just warning ships away from dangerous rocks. Now it was a beacon calling humanity to prepare for the greatest challenge in its history. The first thing the chronicler taught Marcus was how to repair the monitoring equipment. The alien technology was failing after decades without proper maintenance, and they needed to restore the early warning systems before doing anything else. Marcus learned that the lighthouse equipment was only a small part of a global network. Similar monitoring stations existed at other sites around the world, hidden inside ancient structures that humans had built without understanding their true purpose. Stonehenge was one. The pyramids in Egypt contained another. Easter Island, Machu Picchu, and dozens of other locations housed pieces of the same warning system. Working with tools that seemed to respond to thought as much as physical manipulation, Marcus helped the chronicler repair crystalline components and re-establish connections with the other monitoring sites. As each station came back online, their view of approaching threats became clearer and more detailed. The news was not good. The Devourers were moving faster than previous calculations had indicated. Instead of 50 years, humanity had perhaps 30 years to prepare. Maybe less if the enemy detected Earth's preparations and decided to accelerate their approach. The chronicler began sharing technology, but slowly and carefully. Human minds were not designed to process alien science all at once. Too much information too quickly could drive a person insane or kill them outright. Marcus had to learn gradually, building his understanding one concept at a time. The first device they created together was a communication system that could reach anywhere on Earth instantly. It used quantum entanglement to transmit information faster than light, allowing real-time coordination between the monitoring sites. Marcus tested it by contacting other locations where chroniclers might still be imprisoned. Most of the calls went unanswered. After centuries of isolation, many of the other beings had died or fallen so deeply into hibernation that they could not be awakened. But 3 sites responded. Ancient beings still survived in underground chambers beneath structures in China, Peru, and Scotland. Working together across vast distances, the surviving chroniclers began to coordinate humanity's defense preparations. But they faced a fundamental problem. How do you prepare an entire species for war without causing panic, economic collapse, or premature conflict? The solution was to work through existing human institutions while appearing to pursue normal technological development. The chronicler helped Marcus identify scientists, engineers, and military leaders who might be receptive to new ideas. These people received anonymous research grants, mysterious consulting opportunities, and access to experimental technologies that seemed just advanced enough to be believable. Dr. Sarah Chen, a quantum physicist at MIT and no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, was the first person they approached. She had been working on theoretical faster-than-light communication when she received a package containing components that made her theories actually work. The note inside simply said, "Humanity needs this technology. Develop it quickly." General Patricia Williams, recently retired from the Air Force, found herself recruited by a shadowy organization that wanted her to develop new military doctrines for fighting unconventional enemies. The scenarios they gave her seemed like science fiction, but the funding was real and the urgency was convincing. Marcus became the coordinator for these efforts, traveling between the Lighthouse and various facilities around the world. The chronicler could not leave its chamber without risking exposure or death, so Marcus served as its representative in the human world. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Several times government agencies became suspicious of the new technologies appearing without clear origins. Marcus had to use his military connections and engineering credentials to provide cover stories that satisfied investigators without revealing the truth. The biggest breakthrough came when they successfully replicated the chronicler's energy manipulation technology. Human engineers took the basic principles and immediately began weaponizing them in ways the peaceful alien species had never considered. Where the chroniclers had used energy fields for construction and healing, humans created focused beams that could cut through any known material. The chronicler was both amazed and disturbed by human creativity in developing destructive applications. It began to understand why its people had been defeated by the Devourers. They had been too civilized, too reluctant to embrace the brutal tactics necessary for survival against a merciless enemy. Marcus also worked to establish secret manufacturing facilities for the new technologies. Existing defense contractors were gradually infiltrated and redirected toward producing equipment that looked conventional but incorporated alien principles. Spacecraft that appeared to be routine satellites actually carried scanning equipment that could detect Devourer energy signatures from across the solar system. The most challenging part was developing weapons that could actually hurt the Devourers. Traditional explosives and projectile weapons were useless against enemies that could absorb and adapt to any form of attack. The solution came from studying human psychological warfare tactics. Humans had always excelled at fighting enemies by attacking their weaknesses rather than their strengths. The chronicler revealed that Devourers had one critical vulnerability. Their collective consciousness required constant communication between individual units. Disrupt that communication and the swarm would become confused and disorganized. Working with human communications experts, Marcus developed jamming technology that could interfere with Devourer neural networks. The devices used principles from both alien science and human electronic warfare, creating interference patterns that were specifically designed to cause maximum disruption to collective intelligence systems. But weapons were only part of the solution. The bigger challenge was preparing humanity psychologically for what was coming. Humans needed to be ready to fight an enemy that wanted to destroy not just their civilization, but their entire planet. Marcus began working with military psychologists and science fiction writers to introduce concepts that would help people understand the threat. Movies, books, and video games began featuring enemies that resembled the Devourers, The goal was to make the idea of cosmic horror familiar enough that people would not panic completely when the truth was revealed. The chronicler also helped Marcus understand why previous civilizations had failed against the Devourers. Most species tried to preserve their existing way of life while fighting the invasion. They wanted to defeat the enemy without changing themselves. That approach always failed because the Devourers were specifically designed to counter conventional military thinking. Humans would need to embrace radical changes to have any chance of survival. They would need to abandon many of their social and political structures in favor of total war mobilization. They would need to accept genetic and technological modifications that would make them more effective fighters. Most importantly, they would need to overcome their tendency to fight each other and unite against the common threat. This last point was the most difficult. Even as Marcus and his allies worked to prepare Earth's defenses, human nations continued their traditional conflicts. Resources that should have been directed toward defense preparations were instead wasted on territorial disputes and ideological arguments. The chronicler suggested that humanity might need to experience a smaller crisis first, something that would force global cooperation without revealing the true threat. Marcus began working with climate scientists and disaster preparedness experts to identify challenges that could serve as practice runs for the coming war. As the fourth year of their collaboration ended, Marcus looked back on what they had accomplished. Hidden around the world, small groups of humans were developing technologies that seemed impossible. Secret facilities were producing weapons that could theoretically hurt enemies humanity had never encountered. Early warning systems were scanning space for threats that might not arrive for another 26 years. But Marcus also knew how much work remained. 30 years seemed like a long time, but preparing an entire species for total war against cosmic predators was a task that might require centuries. They were racing against time, and the consequences of failure were the complete extinction of human civilization. Standing in the lighthouse chamber beside the chronicler's crystal form, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility that had once crushed his great-uncle. But he also felt something Richard had not experienced: hope. For the first time since the Devourers began their advance across the galaxy, a species was preparing to fight back with weapons specifically designed to exploit enemy weaknesses. The chronicler pulsed with agreement, sharing Marcus's cautious optimism. Humanity's stubborn refusal to accept defeat was already changing how they approached the impossible challenge ahead. If any species could find a way to survive the coming storm, it would be the one that had turned warfare into an art form and made stubbornness a virtue. The lighthouse beam continued its rotation above them, now serving as a symbol of defiance rather than just a warning. Let the Devourers come. Humanity would be ready. 28 years had passed since Marcus first knocked on the basement door. The lighthouse still stood on its cliff, but everything else had changed. The world now knew about the Devourers, and humanity was as ready as it could be for the coming war. The revelation had happened 5 years earlier, when deep space monitoring stations detected the enemy swarm entering the outer edges of the solar system. There had been panic at first, but decades of careful preparation had worked. Movies and books had made the concept familiar. Secret military units were already trained and equipped. The transition from peacetime to total war had been swift and decisive. Marcus was now 54 years old, with gray hair and scars from countless missions around the world. He had become the unofficial ambassador between humanity and the surviving chroniclers, coordinating global defense efforts from the Lighthouse Command Center that had been built around the original structure. The chronicler had grown stronger over the years, fed by the energy from newly constructed power systems and sustained by its renewed sense of purpose. It no longer looked fragile and crystalline. Instead, it had become something magnificent and terrible, a being of pure energy and thought that could interface directly with the quantum computers that controlled Earth's defense grid. The lighthouse itself had been transformed into a fortress. The original beacon still operated, but it was now surrounded by weapon systems that could reach targets anywhere in the solar system. Deep beneath the cliff, vast chambers housed the manufacturing systems that produced humanity's secret weapons. Most importantly, the lighthouse served as the central node for the global communication network that linked every major military installation on Earth. When the final battle began, all of human civilization would be coordinated from this remote cliff in Maine. The Devourers arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. Long-range scanners detected them at the edge of the solar system, a swarm of massive biomechanical entities that defied easy description. Each individual devourer was the size of a small moon, covered in what looked like living metal that shifted and adapted as they moved through space. Marcus stood in the Lighthouse command center, watching holographic displays show the enemy approach. After 3 decades of preparation, the moment had finally arrived. Humanity would learn whether their stubborn refusal to surrender was enough to overcome an enemy that had conquered the galaxy. The first phase of the battle was an information war. As soon as the Devourers entered communication range, they began broadcasting surrender demands in hundreds of languages. They offered to preserve some humans as specimens if the species would submit without resistance. It was the same offer they had made to every civilization they encountered. Humanity's response was delivered simultaneously from every major city on Earth. The message was simple and consistent. No. The Devourers seemed surprised by the unified rejection. Most species either surrendered immediately or began desperate peace negotiations. Humans had not even asked for terms or conditions. They had simply refused to be conquered. The enemy's next move was to demonstrate their power by destroying several asteroid mining stations in the outer solar system. The attacks were precisely calculated to show overwhelming technological superiority while causing minimal actual damage. It was psychological warfare designed to break human resolve. Instead, the destruction of the mining stations triggered the release of previously recorded messages from the world's leaders. Every president, prime minister, and military commander delivered the same speech. Humanity had expected this attack and was prepared to fight. No surrender would be considered under any circumstances. The chronicler shared its amazement through the mental link with Marcus. In its experience, most civilizations began negotiating for survival as soon as the Devourers demonstrated their power. Humans had used the demonstration as an opportunity to declare total war. The real fighting began when the Devourers reached Mars. They expected to overwhelm the planet's defenses quickly and use it as a base for attacking Earth. Instead, they encountered the first surprise humanity had prepared for them. Mars had been evacuated years earlier and converted into a massive trap. The planet's surface was covered with devices that looked like normal mining and terraforming equipment, but were actually weapons systems designed specifically to disrupt Devourer communications. When the enemy landed, they walked into a coordinated ambush that severed the neural links between individual units. For the first time in their history, the Devourers experienced confusion and disorientation. Cut off from their collective consciousness, individual units began acting independently and erratically. Some continued attacking according to their last received orders. Others tried to re-establish communications with the main swarm. A few simply stopped moving entirely. Human forces, hidden in underground bunkers, emerged to attack the confused enemies with weapons based on chronicler technology, but modified with human tactical doctrine. Instead of trying to destroy the Devourers outright, they focused on capturing isolated units and studying their weaknesses. The battle for Mars lasted 3 months. When it ended, humanity had achieved something no other species had managed. They had captured living Devourers and forced the main swarm to retreat from a major engagement. The chronicler was amazed by the tactical reports from Mars. Humans had not just fought the Devourers. They had outthought them, using deception and psychological warfare to turn the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. The collective consciousness that made Devourers so effective in traditional battles became a vulnerability when communication could be disrupted. But the victory on Mars was only the beginning. The main Devourer swarm was still approaching Earth, and they had learned from their defeat. They began developing countermeasures to human jamming technology and adapting their tactics to account for enemy deception. The final battle took place in the space between Mars and Earth. Human forces, reinforced by technologies that combined alien science with human engineering, met the Devourer swarm in the largest space battle in galactic history. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. Devourer bioships tried to overwhelm human defenses through sheer numbers, while human commanders used mobility and unpredictability to avoid being trapped in conventional engagements. Ships would appear from nowhere, strike at vulnerable targets, and disappear before the enemy could respond. Marcus coordinated the battle from the Lighthouse. working with the chronicler to process information from thousands of individual combat units. The mental link between human and alien had grown stronger over the years, allowing them to function as a hybrid intelligence that combined human intuition with alien computational power. The turning point came when human forces managed to capture a Devourer command unit. Instead of trying to destroy it, they used modified chronicler technology to hack into its communication systems. For the first time, humans could see the battle from the enemy's perspective. What they found changed everything. The Devourers were not the unstoppable force they appeared to be. They were actually desperate refugees, fleeing from something even worse that was pursuing them across the galaxy. Their aggression and expansion were driven by terror, not conquest. The true enemy was something called the Silence, a force that consumed not just matter and energy, but the very possibility of existence itself. The Devourers had been running from the Silence for millions of years, destroying other civilizations not out of malice, but because they needed resources to keep running. Armed with this knowledge, Marcus made a decision that would have been impossible for the peaceful chronicler species. Instead of trying to destroy the Devourers, he offered them an alliance. Humanity would help them fight the Silence in exchange for an end to their destructive expansion. The proposal was insane by any reasonable standard. Humans were offering to fight an enemy that had driven the Devourers to flee for millions of years. But insanity was exactly what the situation required. The Devourers accepted the alliance, partly because they were losing the current battle, but mostly because humans had demonstrated something they had never seen before. Humans were willing to fight enemies that were stronger, smarter, and more numerous, simply because fighting was better than surrender. The combined human-devourer forces turned toward the edge of the galaxy, where the Silence was beginning to consume entire star systems. It would be the greatest challenge humanity had ever faced, but it was also the ultimate expression of human nature. Standing in the lighthouse as the last ships departed for the galactic edge, Marcus felt a sense of completion. The lighthouse beam still rotated overhead, no longer warning ships away from dangerous rocks or announcing humanity's defiance. Now it was a beacon of hope, broadcasting across the galaxy that somewhere in the darkness stubborn creatures were still fighting against the night. The chronicler pulsed with something that might have been pride. It had come to Earth hoping to save its own species by preparing humans for war. Instead, it had helped create something new, the alliance between two very different forms of intelligence, united by their refusal to accept extinction. Humanity had not just survived the Devourer invasion. They had turned their enemies into allies and convinced them to fight against an even greater threat.